Bioneers. It's my people. This is where I feel it's the birthplace. It really is a joining of the midwives, the ideas, the ingenuity, the creativity, the sparks of inspiration. Bioneers brings all of these visions and all of this action together.
There's nothing that's off the table here. It's all possible and it's all connected and it's so liberating.
Hello, I'm Imara Jones at Bioneers Conference as a FSTV special correspondent for the coverage of this annual gathering of people who have come together to figure out how to live in balance with themselves, with each other, and the natural world, and what the natural world can teach us all about that. This is the 30th gathering. One of the key points of Bioneers is to bring people together across different sectors and sections who may not be normally together. And that's why we are thrilled today to be talking to Vanessa Raditz, who is the co-founder of the Queer Eco-Justice Project. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What do you think is the role of queer people, LGBTQ people, trans people, gender nonconforming, non-binary, the full range of gender diversity and sexual orientation diversity in the environmental movement?
Wow. Well, I think it goes really, really deep. And one thing that I like to remind people of is that as people that really understand change and transition on a very embodied level, it's not just metaphorical. There's so much wisdom that we have to give to the climate movement in this really liminal transitional time that we're in. So one image that I want people to think of is like, what does it look like to have trans justice for a just transition? To have these two ways of understanding transition and justice come together, because I think there's a lot of power from that history and embodied knowledges of change.
Yeah, it's really interesting how that word here applies to so many different things. I don't actually know how it strikes me that it does, but they were saying that we're in a transitional time in terms of the climate in the world that we know now versus where we're going to end up regardless of what we do. So it's a transitional time in every single way, environmentally, politically, all the rest of it. Vanessa Carr today earlier spoke about that worst part of birth is actually called transition, which I found interesting. And then, of course, when we apply the term to gender identity, or diversity in that respect. So for you as a queer person, how do these three different types of transitions sort of link?
How do they link? There are so many ways. And I think that people that are in the queer and trans community and thinking about this a lot, we understand that transition isn't linear.
That's right.
You don't just move from like, I have this idea of my gender and I want to be over here, and tomorrow I'm going to wake up and that's what I'm going to look like. There's all of this messiness that goes on in the middle, and the ways that we need to hold each other through that are some of the medicine that we need to look at that on a social level as well. I think about like the care networks that people have set up for each other. The way that ACT UP was both doing like political organizing and death dueling for people that were in critical need of that. And so those kinds of transitions, the messiness, the way that we understand that as we get closer and closer to our vision of the future, our ideas of the future may also change.
That's right.
And we need to be responsive to that.
That's right. How have you found introducing the notions and the importance of queerness into environmental justice? I'll start there.
Sure. Yeah. I think first thing is that I want to make it really clear that we're not trying to, like, what I talk a lot about, and I actually work a lot on the impacts of climate change on queer and trans communities and the disproportionate ways that our community is impacted. But I don't do that work to displace all the work that environmental justice has done. I just think that there's a way sometimes where we talk about environmental justice and the way people of color and poor and other marginalized communities are impacted in a way that also makes it invisible, all the gender and sexual diversity that's also within that frontline community. And so part of it is just bringing awareness to the intersectionality of our identities. So I just want to start with that. But in terms of the reception, I feel like in the environmental movement, I mean, I've been doing queer and trans. I've been an out bi person since I was in middle school, and I've been doing environmental organizing since about that time as well. And but they've always been in silos. And I've seen so many queer and trans people in the environmental movement, but also in a way where they don't know how to bring their narrative of why their identities are important to these movements into the work that they do. So that said, doing this work, it's always such a joy, because everywhere I go, people are like, I've been doing this work for so long, and I've never had a space that was just for me to explore how my identity fits in with the environmental work that I do. So it's been a real joy. The one other thing that on that topic that I'm really passionate about, especially in the realm of queer ecologies, is I've been working with the YMCA on developing a curricula for their educators for talking about the gender and sexual diversity of the living world. So understanding that this cis heteronormative lens that most of us were raised in and we were taught science in, that, mating is between a male and a female of some species. When you actually really get down and look and observe and be in nature, things don't act in that cis heteronormative way. There's like over 50 different species of clownfish that can entirely change their sex over the course of their lives, down to their they can change their ovaries, their eggs, to being sperm. Like, that's the level of biological change they go through. Or botanically speaking, a flower that has both pollen producing and pollen receiving parts is known as a perfect flower. And it exists all over the place. Avocados, I love avocados. Avocados come from perfect flowers. So trying to lift that up and lift up that knowledge of nature for the kids. So when the kids are out in nature, they're learning that it's not just okay to be queer or trans, it's natural.
Right, it's reflected in the natural world.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways in which you believe that climate change and environmental justice impact people who are queer? You mentioned that that's one of the things that you emphasize.
Yeah,
what are some of those ways?
So right now I'm working on a documentary based on interviews in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria and here in Northern California after the Tubbs fire that happened that same fall. So there's two disasters at the same time. And so by talking to queer and trans people, a lot of the themes that emerge are things related to the social and economic injustices that queer and trans people face, like mental health issues, things like incarceration, and then during a time of disaster, how that really magnifies. So if you're already a really traumatized person and then you have to go to a shelter where people are misgendering you, you don't have access to your hormones, you don't have access to your psychiatric medications, maybe you were disowned from your parents years ago, you don't have another place to go to outside of that shelter situation. Queer and trans people are more likely to be living with chronic illness and disability. Maybe you don't have access to electricity to charge your powered wheelchair. Those are the kind of stories that emerge. So I think that there's a really basic level where I want to make sure that all first responders to disaster understand things like pronouns and gender identity. But then we've really got to go far deeper to think about how are we evacuating incarcerated people when storms are coming? How do we really make sure that some of the places where queer and trans people are during disasters are well equipped to ensure for their safety and survival?
In the larger mainstream environmental movement, why do you think that there's been this exclusion of queer people and queer narratives?
So, yeah. I think that there are a couple things. I think on a really deep level, going back to that queer ecologies, queer nature stuff, there's a really long history of queer people being told that we're unnatural and that we're crimes against nature. And I think for some people that's kind of under their skin. It's maybe not conscious, but I think that that's there. And you can see that in a lot of contemporary queer culture is very urban. There's a lot of consumerism that's advocated for.
True.
So it's not. I think that there's that level, And then I think there is this other level of just people, there hasn't been a lot of work to make the connections explicit for folks. So like I said, like even with all those underlying things, there are so many LGBTQ people in the environmental movement, from urban farming to on the front lines of the Green New Deal to pipeline resistors, to the amazing work that, for instance, Two-Spirit Nation, when they set up a camp at Standing Rock, like we're there, we're all over the place, but there isn't a really clear narrative for why our identities are important in these spaces.
Do you think that that's changing?
I think it's changing. I think it is. I'm really excited about the work of folks like Queer Nature that are bringing people out to relearn survival skills in the wilderness and find a sense of belonging in nature in places where queer and trans people have been told you don't belong.
Right.
I find a lot of inspiration from Queer Appalachia and these like rural queer communities that are bringing visibility to the fact that queer people, we're out here. We're not just in the cities. And I would consider my partner is a farmer in Western North Carolina. So just bringing visibility to the ways in which queer and trans people are also doing really earth-based work and livelihoods. I see so much changing right now.
Right. And what are you most... Let me rephrase that. When you think about where you would like to see queer people moving forward in the environmental movement, when you imagine the future, what does that look like?
I think that in the future, I think that it's really important, both in the environmental movement and also in the LGBTQ movement at large, that Two-Spirit voices are centered and uplifted, because I think that they remind us of how deep our roots as queer and trans people go to the land and to ancestries where we were sacred and revered, and to do that in a way that also allows the LGBTQ movement to be in alignment with decolonization and really understanding that Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledges of how to relate to the land are part of what we need for this future that we're moving in. I think that we as queer and trans people need to heal relationships with the land and be given space to do that, so that we can reclaim some of those skills for healing in the short term, and for transition, and working with those liminal transitional energies that we embody to heal ourselves and to heal with the land.
And lastly, from Bioneers, how many times have you been to Bioneers?
I've been coming here for over 10 years.
All right, so you've come here for about a third of its lifetime. What is the thing that you...
Third of my lifetime.
And a third of your lifetime. Oh, so you and Bioneers are...
We're siblings,
okay.
Yes.
What is the primary thing that you think this conference has given you?
I don't know. Bioneers is shaped the way that I think about nature on a really deep level, and I think that I'm really grateful to Nina for all the ecofeminist work that she's done that's really opened up space for the kind of queer nature stuff that we're doing now. I'm really grateful for all of the work that they've been doing to try and build right relationship with Indigenous people in this space, and to really think about the environment not just in terms of what we're losing and the planetary calamity that we're in, but to uplift all of the solutions, and that climate change is not just a problem of CO2 levels in the atmosphere, but it's really a catastrophe of social, moral, economic, and political. It's that kind of catastrophe, and so it needs to be dealt with on a social, moral, political, economic level.
Right, it tracks so many other crises, and you could argue that the underpinnings for the climate crisis is the exact same underpinnings for those other crises.
Right, and so it's not like, climate change is so urgent, we need to deal with climate change first, then we'll deal with reparations. It's no, how do we do reparations to transfer wealth that was stolen from people so that we can build the future. You
Right.
know, that social justice is the way we do climate justice. And I
That's
think
right.
I learned that here.
That's right. One person mentioned yesterday in the workshop that we were in the interesting parallels between the same forces and ideologies that resist the idea of transness are the same ones that are also involved in driving the climate crisis. It's a very similar approach in terms of getting you to doubt what you can see with your own eyes, what you can understand, getting you to question the underpinnings of things that are apparent,
Yes.
which is interesting.
Yes. Yeah.
A de-affirmation of your humanity is necessary too, you know.
Absolutely. There's a Two-Spirit author, Coley Driscoll, who I love, who writes about their Cherokee descent, and they write about how the project of colonization was not just the theft of land from people, but it was a theft of people from their own bodies through the kinds of violence to the body that colonization required.
Right.
And so I think, there's a deep parallel with people that are trying to reclaim a relationship with Earth and people that are trying to reclaim a relationship with their own bodies and assert that, no, my knowledge of my body goes a lot deeper than your cis heteropatriarchy that you've taught me in school my whole life. And
Right.
no, I'm going to affirm this and I'm going to pay attention to this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so then the twin kind of those twin crises, those twin points of resistance, it does make sense that they go together, and then it underscored the importance of having queer people at the heart of the environmental justice movement.
Yeah, right. And just affirming that we already are.
That's right.
Like when
That's
I look
right.
around Bioneers, like Bioneers is run and created by so many beautiful, incredible queer and trans people. And so it's just about lifting that up and saying it's important to name that.
Right. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us. All the best to you as you continue to contribute and help to change the world.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you along the trail.
Yeah, this was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us here from Bioneers. Stay tuned here on FSTV.